All right, next up we have Luke Vuilliomenet. Hey, Luke.
Hi.
So tell us a little bit about yourself.
Certainly. My name is Luke Vuilliomenet, and I'm a grad student at the Savannah College of Art and Design. I've been working with Houdini for about 2.5 years at this point. Originally, I started out as lighting look dev, but when I was working on a project collaboratively with some people, I got the opportunity to talk with the effects team, and I just fell in love with what they were doing, and I said, that's what I want to do, and did a complete 180 and started using Houdini.
Excellent. So what's today's presentation going to be about?
I'm going to be talking about the steps I took to creating a flip fluid simulation based off of a real life reference I found, and really focusing on the thought process I took to work with fluid dynamics and how I tried to solve it in an art directable way.
Fantastic. Well, let's get started.
Let's dive inside flip fluids and real life references. I'd like to talk about the steps I took to creating this project, which include reference analysis, particle sourcing / force creation, core fluid simulation, whitewater sourcing, whitewater simulation, and render prep or shader creation. When looking at my reference video, I see I have a source at the top, flowing down the stairs and gathering at the bottom, and flowing off screen to the left. Which brings me to the first main problem of flip, and that is it requires pre-roll. So it takes time for the water to settle into what it's going to behave like. To best handle this problem, I decided to break the sim into two different sources, the stairs themselves and the bottom region. Sourcing and irregularity is the most important part of the simulation, and this is where I spent the majority of my time. I began by creating a particle tank, and then using my environment, I grouped any particles that spawned outside of the desired region and removed them. And I did this to improve stability and speed up simulation. Now, moving on to my stairs themselves, I took the stair geometry, converted it to a VDB, transformed it, and then SDF differenced to create a very thin little region that I can work with. I scattered points inside of this volume, and using a point VOP, added animated noise to the point position to give this really different and irregularity inside of my sourcing. Next, I grouped any of the particles that intersected with stairs or the modeled environment and removed them. Now that I have the points that I want and they're not intersecting with any of my geometry, is that flip fluid is requiring these points to be in a group called particles to be recognized as a valid source, and that's what I've done. I then used noise functions and a ramp inside of point VOP to give me control over the source location, whether that's on the right or left side, top and bottom, as well as create a velocity vector based on an input direction, in this case, down the stairs themselves. And this is what my top source looks like when I'm finished. It's aimed at emulating the wave-like properties seen in the reference, flowing right to left. Now, moving on to forces, I begin by defining a region I want to use, in this case, a box, and I convert it to a VDB to generate a high-density mesh. You could have used a different method, but this is what I just decided to do at this point in time. Next, I use a mountain node to create animated irregularity. Point VOP could have worked as well, but once again, this is just what I decided to do. And this is to really get that undulation and difference, just another layer on top of it. Then I use point from volume to get a large number of points inside of the region to create a velocity vector. Now I use noise functions and ramps to call the points at random, so I can then create my velocity vector, which again adds another layer, adds another bit of non-uniformity. I take my velocity vector and I rasterize it using the volume rasterize attribute node, and I now have a working volume that I can pass into my fluid simulation. This is the force scene setup that I had for my project. At the very top, I have a force pushing the particles down the stairs, and it acts kind of like the water outside of the stairs coming and flowing inward. I have a force in the middle stairs, which is only active during pre-roll, and acts as a pushing force of the water as it begins to flow down the stairs. And at the bottom, I have two forces, one that helps create that bubbling kind of effect as the stair fluid pours into the lower region. And the second force acts as a flow, so it swirls, it spins, and it pushes the fluid off to the left of the side of the screen so that it doesn't just gather there at the bottom. And then finally, I have two sink forces along the outer edges, and this is to prevent too much buildup. as new water and fluid is added into the system, it would have just kept building up and up and up and overflowing. This makes sure that it is not, and it gets taken off and drained to the left. Now that I have everything done for my sourcing, I need to prep for the actual simulation. I take my stairs and my particle tank and I merge them together, and I use a bound node to create the bounding area that I'm going to use, and I later reference inside of the simulation. Next, I need to create collision geometry, and I do this by taking a low-res version of my modeled environment and create VDBs out of them and turn it into a collision geometry. Now that I'm inside of my core simulation, we can look over here on the left. I have my collision objects broken up apart so I can really control how each one is done, and they're each set to volume sample so that they're collidable with the fluid. Now my flip object is set to particle field and is fetching the original particle tank that I created earlier. Pop speed limit is used to prevent the particles from gaining an unrealistic velocity. I had a lot of trouble where the particles were speeding up and overshooting the steps entirely instead of flowing downward and cascading. Gas damp is to further control the velocity when it's being calculated in the pyro simulation. Next are the forces I created earlier, which are turned into pump forces in the volume source node. I then have my pop drag, pop wind to just add another little bit of control to the simulation and again break up and get more irregularity. I broke the stairs points into 3 different regions at the bottom, middle, and top, and then turn it into flip source inside the volume source node, which then recognizes that particle group as an active input. And finally, I have that sync force just to delete points as they're reaching the outer regions of the simulation. Now, once I've done that and I've cached out my white water, I now move on to white water sourcing. First, I take the compressed core fluid and I immediately pass it out in a null node, which I've named out WW volume or out white water volume, which is important for the actual simulation in just a moment. Now I pass this into a white water source and I notice that points were spawning beneath the stairs and rocketing off at odd angles. So to fix this, I then create another white water source, and I do this for only beneath the stairs themselves and use this as a subtraction method inside of a VDB combined so that it's not taking any of the particles that would normally spawn beneath the stairs. Now we get inside of the actual whitewater simulation itself, and inside the whitewater solver, I bring in that volume that I mentioned earlier so that it actually can run correctly and recognize it as a valid source. Now, inside of the whitewater solver, I have to do a couple little bit of management things. First, I did by disabling the density controls to retain finer detail in the whitewater itself. I noticed as I was testing this that it works very well for boat wakes and large ocean simulations, the density controls, but in a small-scale simulation like I had here, it spreads the foam out and prevents details unless the number of max neighbor is greatly increased, which decreases the simulation efficiency. I then use repellents to create the swirling regions that you see traveling along the water surface in the reference video. And finally, the most important thing is I check add state attribute so that I can have that for later rendering and post solutions. Moving on to render prep, we get into the fluid mesh, and I do this by taking the cached core fluid and pass it to a particle fluid surface node. And I also bring in the bounding objects for my modeled environment, such as the ticket machine, stairs, and the walls, to make sure that the water isn't intersecting or traveling inside of these objects. The resulting surface is then peaked inwards along its normals to promote better detail in the crests and peaks of the fluid simulation. For the whitewater, I create a group based on those state attributes I mentioned earlier. Credit for this code goes to Adam on Houdini forums, thank you. And I then adjust the density attribute based on age and depth from the surface, 0 being the surface itself, -1 being below, 1 being above. Once I have this, I rasterize that density attribute in the rasterize node, and I add a rule to it set to accumulate. Now, once I have my volume, I use a VDB and analyze to get the gradient, and I merge this back in, and it's now ready for rendering. Going on into the shader fluid, I use vorticity and velocity to drive the diffuse color and refraction color so that I can really get a little bit of variety inside of those high moving areas. Moving on to the shader for the core fluid, for the volume, I use generate the substrate really, and what this is, I've converted the fluid mesh into a VDB and now passing on this volume shader so that I can really get the substrate. And finally, I have the white water volume, which is just basic white water with these particular settings for the look I wanted. So I've covered reference analysis, particle sourcing, force creation, core fluid simulation, white water sourcing, white water simulation, and render prep and shaders. Thank you for listening to my talk about flip fluids and real-life references. My name is Luke Vuilliomenet, and I'm an FX TD at SCAD. To see more in-depth breakdown of this project and my other work, you can go to my website, lvfxstudios.com. I'm currently looking for internships and job opportunities. If you have an open position, please feel free to reach out to me through my email or on my LinkedIn page.